Hey, this is Pastor Bunjee Garrett, and I want to take this opportunity to present you with another word of encouragement. Now, as we continue to consider the beliefs of those who appear to be ushering in the New World Order, I can't help but to wonder, are we watching a clear case of idiocracy? Or do these people really believe all of the things that they say? And with this question in mind, I just want to take a moment to consider a statement that Al Gore just made yesterday on NBC's Meet the Press. The former vice president, who, remember, produced a controversial climate change video back in 2006, he actually went on the record during yesterday's interview as he compared climate change deniers to the Uvalde officers who did nothing while innocent kids were suffering. That's right. Here's how Al Gore put it, and I quote him here. The climate deniers are really in some ways similar to all of those almost 400 law enforcement officers in Uvalde, Texas, who were waiting outside an unlocked door while the children were being massacred. They heard the screams, they heard the gunshots, and nobody stepped forward. Okay, so according to Al Gore here, those who disagree with the idea that, the carbon emissions of mankind are somehow causing climate change, those who deny this are effectively the same as all the officers who sat back there in Uvalde, Texas and allowed innocent lives to be taken. To that, I must respond with no. No, not at all. That's not even close to being a logical comparison. I mean, seriously, to suggest that this would even be like comparing apples to oranges would be an insult to both apples and oranges. Without debate, Al Gore's comparison is what we would call a false equivalence fallacy. And to explain my point, I want to take a moment to consider a few of the differences between climate change deniers and the officers there in Uvalde. First of all, the officers in Uvalde, they knew that there was an actual threat on campus being caused by an active shooter. There was no debating about it. They weren't standing in the hallway debating about whether a threat actually existed. They knew the threat was there. They just didn't move forward fast enough. In contrast to this, the so-called climate change denier, well, this is typically an individual who has yet to be convinced that climate change is actually being caused by humans. Not only that, but the climate change denier hasn't been convinced about the measures being proposed. The climate change denier isn't sure that these measures, these mitigation measures will actually solve the highly contestable predictions. Simply put, climate change deniers aren't like the Uvalde officers at all because we have yet to be convinced that there's an actual threat. In order to understand why I don't believe that there's an actual climate change threat, I would remind you about the failed predictions of Al Gore. It was back in his 2006 documentary when Gore claimed that Mount Kilimanjaro in Africa would be free of snow by 2016, and yet here we are, it's 2022, there's still snow there on Mount Kilimanjaro. He also assured us that the ice in the Arctic and Antarctica would melt, and then the melting ice would then raise global sea levels, thereby displacing coastal populations. And he even doubled down on this prediction in 2009. That's when Gore assured us that the North Pole, it would be ice-free by the summer of 2013 because of man-made global warming, and yet there's still ice. Listen, in order to prove that he actually believed his own prediction, Al Gore then moved immediately inland, away from any coast, right? In order to avoid the inevitable flooding that would, it was actually a year after that prediction when Al Gore spent nearly $9 million on a gated ocean view villa right there in Montecito, California. Now listen, nothing says I believe in my climate catastrophe predictions like choosing to live in a massive mansion that overlooks the Pacific Ocean. But not to worry, because listen, he tried to offset his increasing carbon footprint by then adding solar panels and other energy-saving features, to his other 10,000 square foot mansion in Belmead, Tennessee. And while he claims to live a carbon-free lifestyle to the maximum extent possible, the evidence actually proves otherwise. As a matter of fact, within the course of just 1 month, the Gore's home there in Tennessee consumed more electricity than the average family uses in 34 months. The electricity used just to heat Al Gore's swimming pool would power 6 normal-sized homes for a year. And listen, this doesn't even begin to factor in the energy used at his California mansion. Now, listen, I could care less about how much carbon, how much carbon emissions. I could care less about Al Gore's carbon footprint, so to speak. I mean, and the reason why is because I don't see any evidence that leads me to believe that the slight increase of temperature that we've experienced has been caused by human emissions. Al Gore can use all the electricity that he wants as far as I'm concerned. But on the other hand, listen, Al Gore claims to believe in man-made climate change. That's what he believes. And yet at the same time, he continues to increase his carbon footprint while simultaneously insisting that those who are climate deniers are actually hurting the future generations. So then, to use his own analogy, wouldn't this make Al Gore more comparable to the Uvalde shooter? I believe so. Listen, if Al Gore really practiced what he preached, then he would stop living in two mansions that are larger than what any person actually needs, and he would stop heating his pools, and he would truly try to achieve a zero emissions lifestyle. But he doesn't. He doesn't. No, instead, he would rather demonize those who really aren't buying into the whole climate change story. It's also important for us to realize that the climate change alarmists, they're ready to destroy society in an attempt to save the planet. For example, let's just consider the alarming statement made by Maurice Strong. And just to be clear, Maurice Strong organized the first UN Earth Climate Summit in 1992. And here's what he believes. I quote him here. "We may get to the point where the only way of saving the world will be for industrialized civilization to collapse." That's right. Are you ready to give up your cell phone? Are you ready to give up your electricity? Are you ready to give up your refrigerator? Yeah, you got to do it if you want to save the world. These climate change alarmists are ready to destroy every industrialized civilization in order to save us from a problem that they have yet to prove actually exists. Oh, don't get me wrong, because listen, I understand that we've experienced a slight increase of temperature. But listen, before that, back in the 70s, they were actually predicting an ice age. Why? Because of a slight decrease in temperature. And now, we do find actually, some scientists who don't seem to be swayed by politics, and they're actually predicting another cooling trend on the way. For example, it was back in 2015 when Dr. Don Eastbrook unveiled evidence for his prediction that global cooling was actually coming soon, according to his research. Dr. Easterbrook is not only the emeritus professor of geology at Western Washington University, but he's actually authored more than 150 peer-reviewed papers, and so he's an extraordinary scientist. And according to the research of Dr. Easterbrook, the Earth has been through many cycles of global warming and global cooling, and here's how he puts it. He was actually speaking to a scientific panel with other climatologists, and this is what he said, and I quote, "Rather than global warming at a rate of 1 Fahrenheit per decade, records of past natural cycles indicate that there may be global cooling for the first few decades of the 21st century to about 2030. And not only that, he went on to say this. He predicted that there would be another warming trend from 2030 to 2060, followed by another cooling spell from 2060 to 2090. With all this in mind, I should point out that there are some scientists who believe that these global temperature cycles aren't caused by human carbon emissions at all, but instead they point to the oceanic cycles which fluctuate between cooling modes and warming modes. And the research has actually been carried out by eminent climate scientists, including Professor Mojib Latif, who actually is leading, he's a leading member of the UN's Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And so he's not just, some guy that has nothing to do with any of this. He's deep in the middle of all of this. And according to Professor Latif, and according to his colleagues, there's a significant share of the warming that we saw between 1980 and 2000 that was largely due to these oceanic cycles. Not only that, but it was back in 2008 when he wrote a paper where they actually predicted the global cooling trend that's currently taking place right now and which could last for at least 2 decades or even longer. And listen, if they're correct, then this would explain the warming and the cooling trends that have taken place since the early 20th century. For example, between 1915 to 1940, global temperatures were on the rise as the world enjoyed a 25-year warm mode. It was back in 1922 when the Washington Post assured us that Greenland's glaciers were actually disappearing, and the Arctic, was losing its ice, and it was becoming too hot for the seals to live. But then in the late 1940s, all the way to the 1970s, climate change scientists were beginning to record this cooling trend, and this cooling trend was despite the rising carbon dioxide levels happening in the earth. And I remember being told back then that in the early 70s that we're all headed for an ice age. Yeah, in the public schools, we were told we were headed for an ice age. And it was 1974 when Time magazine went as far as predicting another ice age, as they assured us that farming and fuel burning was stopping sunlight from reaching the earth. But then in 1980 until 2007, we witnessed the ice age predictions fail as warming trends began to impact the planet once again. And you better believe that the politicians and the media were quick to create and capitalize global hysteria. And yet here we are in the beginning of the 21st century, and we're currently witnessing another cooling trend. For example, it was 2010 when Britain suffered the coldest winter in 30 years. And February 2021, that's when we here in Texas experienced the coldest winter in decades. And this was precisely the prediction presented by those who promote the ocean cycle theory. All of this to say that the science isn't settled. And when it comes to the question of climate change, there's different ideas about what's happening. But what we can say for sure is this, that Al Gore is a hypocrite. Time would fail me to present you with the long list of failed predictions made by Al Gore and other such climate change alarmists. At the same time, though, we do know that all of the prophecies presented in the Bible will be fulfilled and without fail. And while this is not to suggest that all of the prophecies have been fulfilled already, listen, the thousands of biblical prophecies that have already come to pass were fulfilled to the T. Every smallest detail was fulfilled. And this provides us with statistical proof that we can now believe in the reliability of the rest of the prophecies that are still yet future tense. And with that being the case, we would all do well to realize that the biblical prophecies that reveal the future in advance, they're always going to be more accurate than the predictions made by Al Gore and his ilk. It's for this reason that I encourage you to spend more time studying the scriptures so that we can continue to fight the good fight of faith, and all for the glory of God.